there's been talk of boycotting the World Cup, a move that's not quite without precedent, but one that, if it occurred this time, could absolutely shatter the football world. European football leaders are increasingly concerned about Donald Trump's wish to annex Greenland, and they have held initial discussions about how to respond.
We are going to do something on Greenland, whether they like it or not.
We need Greenland for national security. One way or the other, we're going to get it.
This would signal the end of NATO as we know it, but we'll leave that conversation to other departments of The Guardian. What we want to know is, how would football respond to this new world order? Has it happened before? How does this happen? Who makes the decision? And what would happen next? There are 3 options available. The first one, carry on as planned. Ignore calls from, of all people, Sepp Blatter. Secondly, a country could boycott itself and hope that other countries follow suit. And finally, a really radical option, change the host nation or one of the co-hosts altogether. There have been quite a few other World Cup boycotts before. Now, the circumstances have been different on pretty much every occasion. We could go back to 1934. Uruguay, who had won the first ever World Cup in 1930, opted not to defend their title, essentially because they weren't happy that not many European teams were going to be taking place in the next tournament. They also boycotted in 1938, along with Argentina. Argentina had expected to be hosting that tournament, and instead they didn't get it. Then moving on to 1950, India boycotted the World Cup because, allegedly, they didn't really think it would be worth it. In 1958, 4 teams refused to play against Israel in the qualifiers and thus ruled themselves out of competing in the World Cup itself. In 1966, famously, Africa boycotted the World Cup in England in protest at being granted only potentially 1 slot. Had Ghana qualified back then, they could have given England a run for their money, so there's an alternative history there. And in 1982, and this is the situation that's maybe the most comparable to the current time, there were discussions about what would happen if England played Argentina at the World Cup, given the backdrop of the Falklands War. The line was very much that the Football Association would follow what the government decided to do. The FA, being a fairly cautious conservative organisation, an influential one within football, but not a particularly radical voice, I would expect in this case the Football Association would follow what the British government, who is very conscious of its relationship with the United States, of course, decided to do. There's an alternative reality where the football bodies get fed up with the politicians procrastinating or equivocating or anything like this and choose to take the situation forward themselves. But I think in the specific case of England, we'd be looking at the FA following the government. Would you be in favour of a boycott like that? Would you be happy not to watch the games, not to take a trip to the US? It's a very interesting question, and just anecdotally, to my mind, there's a bit of a split maybe between those who really value the escapism and the sense of community and festival that a World Cup brings you every summer. You don't have to be at the tournament. You don't have to travel to the US or put yourself potentially in a dangerous situation to enjoy a tournament. You can be watching with your mates, you can be in the pub, you can be watching on a big screen, having these moments of coming together. Now, I think a lot of supporters would not want that moment taken away from them, and I would fully respect that opinion. I also think there is a subset of people, and it's probably more than a subset. I think there's a big public impulse to condemn the actions of the US administration recently, both the ICE situation in Minneapolis and also, of course, the designs of Donald Trump on Greenland. And I think there's probably more of a public opinion than we might have had a year or 2 ago to say, no, hold on, something has to happen. Even if we have to sacrifice something that we like, enough is enough. And while we focus on the geopolitical ramifications, those out in the US have a greater concern: fan safety.
Hi, I'm Jeff Reuter, one of The Guardian's new soccer correspondents. I'm also a lifelong Minnesotan, and I currently live in St. Paul, the state's capital and one of the Twin Cities along with Minneapolis. The whole state has recently seen a spike of ICE's presence during its so-called Operation Metro Surge. Their acts include 2 senseless killings committed by their agents. Their methods, by large, consist of profiling based on one's complexion, having detained a large number of legal residents and citizens as federal agents act with skepticism around many people's legal status purely based on how they look.
Are there any examples of ICE being deployed to sporting events?
Last week, it was announced that ICE would also be present outside of the Super Bowl. Levi's Stadium is also a World Cup venue, and therefore this could be a testing ground for ICE positioning themselves outside of World Cup games.
I've been looking forward to the World Cup coming to the United States for a really long time. Basically, from the moment I heard that it could be coming here, I've been really, really excited about this tournament. I've been excited for the attention that it'll bring to soccer in this country. I've been excited to see how everybody is going to experience soccer in the U.S., what they're going to think about our cities, our towns, the way it's grown since we first held the tournament in 1994. But I have found over the last several weeks that hope and that anticipation has changed into something that more resembles dread or nervousness. It's a question of safety in the United States.
Yeah, well, I think safety and security is the number one priority.
If there's even a hint of a problem, we want to get in there before the problem occurs. We want to make it totally safe for Johnny and FIFA.
President Trump's immigration crackdown has led to 5 deaths since it started at the hands of immigration officers. And I think the combination of those incidents and the administration's response to it, in which they basically lied about both these people and lied about the circumstances that led to their deaths, I think that causes a really, really large concern about how they might approach a similar situation at the World Cup.
Alex, this is your dream. It's a once in a lifetime opportunity. So how would you feel if there was a boycott?
If it did happen to go through, I think it would be pretty justified. You know, the World Cup being held in places with destructive or harmful governments is really nothing new. I do think that if it does happen, there isn't a lot of room to complain. I think it would be pretty justified simply based on the actions of the United States' own government.
So would a boycott matter to Donald Trump, who really values shows of strength and aggression? I think so. I think one thing that Donald Trump historically and traditionally doesn't enjoy very much is embarrassment. And he and his administration have set a lot of stock in this World Cup, in the relationship with FIFA, in the relationship with Gianni Infantino, how the US is leading this 3-country bid.
We were actually, Mr. President, so happy that the World Cup 2026 will take place in the United States, in Canada and in Mexico.
In the United States, Canada, Mexico.
Now, if that was taken away from Donald Trump, it does not look good. It is politically, sportingly, optically a disaster after all of the bombast that has happened around this. You remember the World Cup draw. You remember how lavish that show was in Washington, D.C. If that was all for nothing, it would be a seriously embarrassing look for a man who detests embarrassment. Now, Gianni Infantino, as we know, is very close to Donald Trump and has been for a long time. But should this boycott materialise, surely there'd be calls for him to resign. It's a fair question, and a question that people within FIFA would also ask, a question that people within UEFA and the other confederations would also ask. Gianni Infantino's situation would not be tenable if a raft of countries boycotted the World Cup. But we're way out of what's normal these days in football. So I'm on the fence on that one. I think it would still take quite a lot to unseat Gianni Infantino at this point. It's worth noting that Gianni Infantino is up for another re-election as FIFA president next year. But what if he had an opponent this time? Especially a good one. Now, what would the red lines for a boycott realistically be? We've all seen the deeply, deeply troubling and indeed tragic actions of ICE recently, especially in Minneapolis, but also elsewhere. My sense is that, deeply disturbing as these actions are, they wouldn't feed into any idea for a boycott. Now, where the red line really is, I think, and I got this impression from speaking to quite a few people around European football in the last week or two, is if Donald Trump had decided, or heaven forbid, still does decide, to take Greenland or attempt to take Greenland by military force. I think troops going into Greenland, armoured vehicles going into Greenland, would be the red line for a lot of European football chiefs, FAs, and of course governments to say, hold on, this cannot hold. So what's the precedent here? Now, the actions of Russia are deeply relevant, it could be argued that they went ahead and held the 2018 World Cup despite having already invaded Crimea and parts of Donbass. But fast forwarding a few years, it could equally be noted that after their full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, they have been unable to play competitive football. They've been barred from World Cups and from European Championships because, essentially, other teams didn't want to play them. I would have expected that if the US was to invade Greenland, we'd be in a similar situation there where other countries look at that Russia precedent and say, we do not want to play you. At this point, a boycott is distinctly unlikely and has thankfully receded further as a possibility since Donald Trump appeared to walk back his threats to Greenland last week. But make no mistake, the fact that people have had to discuss this, the fact that we're having this conversation now, the fact that football's leaders have been meeting and the subject has come up, shows what an extraordinary situation this is. What a fast-moving one. A situation that people will not be able to fully take their eyes and minds off until the World Cup starts. So watch this space and we'll see what happens next.
We want them to come, we want them to celebrate, we want them to watch the game, but when the time is up, they'll have to go home.